Hello everybody. In previous videos we've shown how to install Rust on Windows and then how to set up a development environment for Rust using Visual Studio Code. In this video we're going to put a lot of that aside and concentrate mainly on Git. Git is a source code manager. You can use Git for managing your Rust source code, but this is a more general tutorial aimed at anyone who wants to manage source code and other digital assets using Git on Windows. A lot of you may already be familiar with Git, or at least have an understanding of what it's used for. Again, we're not going to concentrate too much on the workings of Git in this video. There are plenty of tutorials online that will do that. We'll concentrate mainly on the installation and configuration of the Git environment on Windows. So let's get started installing Git on Windows. First, open up your browser and go to git-scm.com. On the home page, click the download button to download the 64-bit installer for Windows. We're going to save a copy of that locally and run it. Okay, allow the installer to make changes. At this stage we can shut down the browser. We're going to accept most of the default installation options and components. The first thing we want to change is Git's default editor. We saw in the previous video how to install VS Code, so we're going to select this as Git's editor. There are other options on there for Notepad++ and a variety of others if you prefer. We'll let it make modifications to the path. We'll look at using HTTPS later. We do want to use OpenSSL, but this causes some complications, as we'll see later. Not interested at the moment in cross-platform projects, so choose the bottom option. We can always change that later if we require. I'm not a fan of them in TTY terminal and suspect that most people using Windows would prefer something they're familiar with like cmd.exe. In fact, we'll use PowerShell for most of the Git demonstrations in this video, but for now we'll use the Windows default console window. It'll take a few minutes to install. So we're done. Uncheck the box to view the release notes and we're done. So let's have a play with Git and see what we've got. First, let's open the PowerShell window. That's good. It shows that Git is installed and working. One of the nice features of Git is that when we type git help followed by the name of a Git command, it will open up an HTML page in our favourite browser with help for that command. You can even do git help git and it will show you some fairly extensive manual pages. So if we want to use Git to manage some source code, we should probably start by generating some. As in previous videos, we'll use cargo to generate a simple package containing some Rust code. So this is the new package that Cargo has created containing some Rust code. However, what we don't immediately see is that Cargo New has created a hidden subfolder in our package which contains the Git metadata. This is called the Git repository. If we weren't using Cargo to create the package, we would have to create this manually using the git init command. To see the current status of the package according to Git, run git status. If we look at the files under the management of Git, then initially we don't have any. We can use git add to add them. The 3 files that were created by Cargo New have now been placed under Git source control. If we run git status again, we can see that these changes have yet to be committed. We can't commit anything yet because we haven't told Git who we are. We'll do that now. Notice that we need to specify the ---- global option to tell Git that these changes should apply to this and all other repositories. We'll talk a little bit about GitHub in the next video, but if you're going to be pushing repositories up to GitHub, then the email address and username should match your details on GitHub. Now we've told Git who we are, we can commit the changes we've made. Notice it's requesting comments be entered about the commit in a file which has been opened in VS Code. This is because we specified VS Code as the default editor when we install Git. Let's add a few comments. Let's save that and exit. Now if we check the status, we can see there's nothing further to commit. However, what we have is a load of unsightly error messages caused when we invoked VS Code. Before we fix these errors, let me explain what's going on. If you remember, we asked the Git installation to configure our default editor to be VS Code, which it's done. However, there are 2 different ways of invoking VS Code, and one of them is currently problematic. This is the way Git is configured to invoke VS Code, and whilst it correctly invokes the editor, you can see that a number of warning messages have been generated in the PowerShell console window. A better way of invoking VS Code is to use the code.cmd batch file. This achieves the same thing in that it still invokes the editor, but it does so without leaving a lot of spurious errors in the terminal window. So the fix for this in Git is to change the core editor as follows. Now let's make some changes to our source code. We'll open the current folder in VS Code and edit the Rust source code. Save the changes and exit VS Code. Check the repository with Git status and we see we have a modified file. Okay, that's a pending change to be committed. Commit the changes. We need to enter some comments using the editor. Save the changes, exit the editor. Right, that's much better. We've saved the changes in the editor, and when we come out of the editor we don't see all those messy error messages in our terminal window. One of the features of Git is the ability to compare different commits to see what has been changed. The command git diff head caret compares the most recent commit with the previous one. So this is telling us that the commits differ in the file main.rs, where the line which prints hello git was previously hello world. No surprises there, but what if I could compare those files in a more visually appealing way using a code editor? This is where VS Code again steps up. We can configure VS Code to be both Git's diff tool and its merge tool. As an aside, all your global settings in Git are stored in a file called .gitconfig in your home directory. There's actually nothing stopping you editing this file directly. So here are all the settings. Now, instead of using git diff, we can use git difftool. You can see the two files are displayed in VS Code side by side for comparison. It's a bit easier on the eye than the text output of git diff. If there were multiple files which were different, each time you exit VS Code, it would move on to the next one, but in this case there's only one which has been modified between commits. I could also demonstrate the git mergetool functionality, but that requires a remote repository. We'll cover remote repositories, such as those on GitHub later. Just to recap what we've done so far. We've installed Git for Windows. We've created an empty Git repository, added some files we wanted Git to track, and staged changes to those files. We've created an initial global configuration for Git, including our username and email address. We've committed our changes to the repository. We've tweaked the Git default editor so it invokes VS Code without a bunch of warning errors. We've configured Git to use VS Code for both the difftool and mergetool. And we've used Git difftool to compare changes between two commits using VS Code. At this stage, it's worth pointing out that once you've installed Git for Windows, you can access most of its features directly from within VS Code itself. Let me give you an example. First, let's create a new cargo package called VS Code Git. As we saw earlier, cargo new creates a Git repository along with the Rust source code and the cargo.toml files. Currently, none of the files in the cargo package are being tracked by Git. We're going to open the current folder in VS Code. Because we've installed Git for Windows, we can see on the left-hand side there now appears a source control button with a badge showing the number of pending changes. If we get a new terminal window up, run git status, we can see that the number of untracked files is confirming what we see in VS Code. Previously we staged the files using git add. We can now achieve exactly the same thing in VS Code by hovering over the changes title in the source control view and clicking on the plus button. See the status of the files changes to index added. Run git status. This confirms that the files have been added to the staging area and are waiting to be committed. Previously we ran the git commit command to commit the changes. This can be done from VS Code by clicking the tick button. This time we'll be prompted to enter a commit message in VS Code. Now if we look at the changes, there are none, and we can confirm this by running git status. Nothing to commit, working tree clean. Now let's make some changes to our source code. Click on the Explorer view, open up the src folder and click on the main.rs file. Make some simple changes. Save the changes. Now if we go to change control, we can see the changes indicated by an M for modified. We can again click on the plus button to stage the changes. Let's say we want to check the difference between the files that have been staged and the previous version. We can either click on the file in the change control view or go to Explorer view and click the Open Changes button. Assuming we're happy with the changes, we can return to the change control window and click on the tick to commit them. Before we committed it, we'd probably test the code using the code LLDB debugger as we showed in the previous video. However, if it turns out there had been a problem when we debugged the code after we had committed it, we could revert the commit. Click on the More Actions ellipses and undo last commit. The changes become staged again. Click on the minus button to unstage the changes. And then we can discard them by clicking on this button here. When we confirm that we're sure, the changes are discarded. And we revert to the original version. So the final takeaway is probably that you don't need to be able to execute Git commands from the command line if you're using VS Code. The one thing we've yet to do is look at remote repositories. What gives Git its power is the ability to have developers all over the world collaborating on the same development projects. GitHub is often used in these scenarios to allow multiple developers to synchronize their development effort back to a service like GitHub. See you in the next video.